The world had been reduced to the groan of wood and the relentless jostle of the stagecoach for 3 days. Evelyn Monroe felt the ache in her bones, a deep, weary thrum that had settled into her very marrow. Each lurch and shudder was a reminder of how far she had come, and how far she still had to go. Outside the grimy window, the Montana Territory unfolded itself, a brutal and breathtaking tapestry of creation. Vast forests of pine clawed at the sky, their scent sharp and clean, cutting through the stale air inside the coach. The trail was a ribbon of thick, unforgiving mud, churned by the hooves of the 6-horse team that strained against their harnesses. The wind had a voice here, a low, mournful howl that swept down from the jagged peaks in the distance, carrying a chill that promised an early and unforgiving winter. It was a land that did not care for the troubles of men, and especially not for the sorrows of a lone woman. Evelyn pressed her forehead against the cool glass, her reflection a pale, ghostly oval superimposed over the passing wilderness. She was 26, but the last year had carved a decade onto her face. The eyes that stared back at her were shadowed with a grief that had long since run out of tears, leaving only a hollowed-out stillness. It was just 6 months since she had buried Reverend Thomas Monroe, the man who had been her husband, her provider, and ultimately, her ruin. She could still feel the stifling air of their small Ohio church, thick with the scent of beeswax and self-righteousness. Thomas had been a man of grand pronouncements and small faith, his sermons ringing with condemnations he himself could not heed. He preached temperance while sipping whiskey from a flask hidden in his study. He spoke of charity while running up debts with every merchant in town. And when his sins finally came to light, the pilfered collection plates, the desperate letters to a woman in a neighboring county, he did not repent. He had simply withered, collapsing under the weight of his own hypocrisy, succumbing to a fever of the lungs as if his body were expelling the last of his tainted spirit. But the congregation's judgment did not die with him. It had turned on Evelyn, the preacher's wife, the silent partner to his disgrace. The whispers followed her down the street, sharp and stinging as horseflies. They said she must have known. They said she was complicit in his deceit, a Jezebel hiding behind a preacher's name. The women who once shared recipes and sewing patterns now clutched their Bibles tighter when she passed, their face masks of pious pity that barely concealed a venomous satisfaction. She was destitute, shamed, and utterly alone. The advertisement in a tattered copy of the Cincinnati Gazette had felt like a lifeline thrown into a raging sea. Cook wanted, hard work, fair pay, sea, Wade Ranch, Bear Creek, Montana Territory. No questions asked. And so she had sold the last of her meager possessions, packed a single trunk, and fled west, chasing the desperate hope that a place with no questions would also be a place with no memory. The stagecoach finally groaned to a halt in a clearing that seemed to be clawed out of the wilderness itself. "End of the line, ma'am," the driver called down, his voice rough as gravel. "Wade's man is here with the wagon." Evelyn stepped down, her legs unsteady beneath her. The air was thin and bit at her cheeks. Before her stood a sprawling ranch, a collection of sturdy, unadorned log buildings that seemed to have grown from the very earth they stood on. The main house was long and low-roofed, with a stone chimney breathing a thin plume of gray smoke into the vast, indifferent sky. Barns and corrals were laid out with a clear, efficient logic. Everything was well kept, the fences mended, the wood piles neatly stacked. Yet, a profound silence hung over the place. It was the silence of emptiness, of a home without a heart. A grizzled man with a drooping mustache nodded at her. "Mrs. Monroe, I'm Jed. Mr. Wade's waiting." He loaded her trunk onto a flatbed wagon with an air of practiced weariness and gestured for her to climb up beside him. The man himself was standing on the porch of the main house as they approached. Cullen Wade was taller than she had expected, broad in the shoulder, with a stillness about him that was more intimidating than any overt threat. He did not move, simply watched her approach, his face an unreadable landscape of hard lines and shadows. A pale, jagged scar sliced down from his left temple, narrowly missing his eye and ending near the corner of his mouth, giving him a permanent, mirthless twist to his lips. His eyes were the color of a winter sky just before a storm, gray and cold and holding secrets deep within their depths. He looked like a man who had been to war, not just with other men, but with life itself, and had emerged victorious, but not unscathed. "You're the cook," he said. It was not a question. His voice was a low rumble, the sound of rocks grinding together. Evelyn smoothed the front of her worn gray dress, her hands trembling slightly. "Yes, sir, Evelyn Monroe." He gave a curt nod, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in her patched dress, her worn-out boots, the exhaustion etched onto her face. It was not the look of a man appraising a woman, but of a rancher inspecting livestock. "The ad said you can cook for a crew of 10. Can you?" "I can, sir, plain, hearty meals. I can bake bread, mend clothes, and keep a clean house." "Don't need a house cleaner, just a cook," he stated flatly. He turned and pushed the door open. "Your room is in the back, kitchen's through there, supper is at 6, breakfast at dawn. You'll get your supplies once a month from Bozeman. Pay is $30 a month, plus board." He paused, his stormy eyes locking onto hers. "I have one rule. You do your work, and you don't ask questions. You understand?" The words hung in the air, a clear and final boundary. "I understand, Mr. Wade," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He seemed satisfied with that. Good. And with that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the house, leaving her standing alone on the porch, the cold wind whipping her skirts around her ankles. The days that followed fell into a grueling rhythm dictated by the sun and the appetites of 10 hard-working men. Evelyn rose in the dark, the cold floorboards a shock to her bare feet. She stoked the fire in the massive iron stove, hauled water from the well, and set about preparing breakfast. The ranch hands would file in at dawn, their faces weathered and bearded, their movements economical and tired. They ate quickly and silently, their eyes cast down at their plates. They were not unkind, but they were distant, their gazes sliding past her as if she were a piece of furniture. She learned their names from their own spare conversations. Jed, the old hand who had driven her from the clearing. Silas, a young man with sad eyes. Hank, a burly man with a booming laugh that he rarely used. In this world of men, she was a stark and solitary anomaly. She felt their curiosity like a physical touch, a constant, low-level hum of awareness. She was the only woman on a ranch miles from the nearest town, a fact that left her feeling raw and exposed, as if she wore no skin at all. She kept her eyes down, her answers to any direct comment brief and polite. She worked until her hands were raw and her back screamed in protest, finding a strange comfort in the sheer physical exhaustion. It left no room for thinking, no space for the ghosts of her past to whisper in her ear. Cullen Wade remained a remote and formidable presence. He ate with his men, but apart from them, at the head of the long wooden table, he rarely spoke. But when he did, his words were law. He moved with a quiet, predatory grace, his eyes missing nothing. Evelyn learned to read the subtle shifts in his mood, the tightening of his jaw when a fence line was down, the slight narrowing of his eyes when a horse went lame. He was a man who held his world together with sheer force of will, and he did not suffer fools or weakness gladly. He never addressed her directly after that first day, but she felt his gaze on her often, a heavy, assessing weight that made the fine hairs on her arms stand on end. The loneliness of the place was a living thing. The vast, empty spaces between the buildings were filled with the sighing of the wind and the distant lowing of cattle. There was no music, no idle chatter, no laughter to break the oppressive silence. It was a ranch built for work, not for living, and it seemed to reflect the desolate landscape of its owner's soul. A week into her employment, the tension that had been simmering beneath the surface finally broke. It was after supper. The men had eaten their fill of beef stew and Evelyn's fresh-baked bread. and had already filtered out into the cool night. Heading for the bunkhouse, Evelyn was clearing the table, her arms aching from a day spent kneading dough and scrubbing pots. Cullen Wade sat where he always did, nursing a cup of black coffee, his long legs stretched out before him. The room was quiet, save for the crackling of the fire in the hearth and the clatter of the plates she was stacking. She gathered the last of the dishes, her back to him. The silence stretched, becoming heavier, more charged. She could feel him watching her, the intensity of his stare like a brand on her skin. She turned, her arms full of dirty plates, intending to retreat to the relative safety of the kitchen. His voice stopped her, low and rough in the quiet room. "That's not what I paid for tonight." Evelyn froze, her heart seizing in her chest. The words were so unexpected, so jarring, that for a moment she was certain she had misheard. She turned slowly to face him. He had not moved. He was staring into his coffee cup, his scarred face illuminated by the flickering firelight. There was no hint of a smile on his lips, no softness in his eyes. I beg your pardon," she stammered, her voice thin and reedy. He lifted his gaze from the cup, and his eyes, cold and gray, met hers. He did not repeat himself, he just held her stare, his expression unreadable, impenetrable. Was it a joke? A cruel, tasteless jest meant to mock her vulnerability? Or was it something else? A warning, a statement of expectation? Her mind raced, a frantic scramble of fear and confusion. The $30 a month, the board, the isolation. Had she misunderstood the terms of her employment? The thought sent a wave of nausea through her. He said nothing more. After a long, agonizing moment, he pushed himself to his feet, placed his empty cup on the table, and walked out of the room without another word, leaving her standing in the middle of the floor, the weight of the dirty plates in her arms suddenly unbearable. That night, Evelyn did not sleep. She lay in her small, cold room, the rough wool blanket pulled up to her chin, and stared into the oppressive darkness. She had pushed a chair up under the doorknob, a flimsy barricade against a threat she could not name. Cullen's words echoed in her head, twisting and turning, refusing to be silenced. "That's not what I paid for tonight." Shame, hot and familiar, washed over her. It was the same shame she had felt under the accusing eyes of the congregation, the shame of being a woman alone, her worth and her safety subject to the whims of men. Had she been a fool to come here? Had she traded one prison for another, more desolate one? Fear was a cold knot in her stomach. She was trapped. The nearest town was a day's ride away, and she had less than $2 to her name. She had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. The vast, silent wilderness outside her window suddenly felt like the walls of a cage, locking her in with a man whose intentions were a terrifying mystery. Her thoughts drifted back, unbidden, to the day she had decided to leave Ohio. It was a Sunday, 2 weeks after Thomas's funeral. She had forced herself to attend service, believing it was her duty, her last penance. She had sat alone in the family pew, a pariah in her own church. Reverend Brown, Thomas's replacement, had delivered a sermon on the sins of falsehood and the sanctity of the church's coffers. He never used Thomas's name, but every eye was on her, every word a stone cast in her direction. After the service, as she tried to slip out unnoticed, Mrs. Gable, the head of the Ladies' Aid Society, had blocked her path. Her face, usually wreathed in a benevolent smile, was a tight knot of disapproval. "Evelyn," she had said, her voice loud enough for all to hear, "it is a mercy the Lord took the Reverend when he did, to save him from further temptation." The other women gathered around, a flock of crows in their Sunday best, their eyes glittering with malice. They spoke of her husband's debts, the shame he had brought upon them, and her own failure as a wife to guide him toward a more righteous path. They were judging her for his sins, condemning her for surviving him. In that moment, surrounded by their cold, merciless piety. Evelyn had felt something inside her break. The grief, the fear, the humiliation. It all coalesced into a single, hard point of resolve. She would not stay here to be pecked to death by these righteous crows. She would go somewhere they could never reach her. She would go west. Now, lying in the dark in a remote Montana ranch house, she wondered if she had only managed to run deeper into the same trap. By morning, exhaustion had given way to a fragile, steely anger. Fear was a luxury she could not afford. She would not spend another night barricaded in her room, waiting for a shadow to fall across her door. She would not live in silence, bartering her dignity for a roof over her head. She had faced down the judgment of an entire town. She would not be cowed by one cryptic, cruel sentence from a scarred and silent man. She would confront him. She would demand to know what he meant. And if his answer was what she feared, then she would walk away from this place, even if it meant starving on the open prairie. She found him in the barn, mending a leather harness. The air was cool and smelled of hay and horsehide. The only sounds were the rhythmic pull of the awl and the soft snorting of a horse in a nearby stall. He did not look up as she approached, though she knew he was aware of her presence. She stood before him, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Mr. Wade." He continued his work, pulling the waxed thread taut. "Mrs. Monroe." The words caught in her throat. She swallowed, forcing them out. "I need to know what you meant. Last night." He finally stopped his work and slowly raised his head. His gray eyes were flat, unreadable. He looked at her, at the defiant tilt of her chin, the tremor in her hands, the fear and fury warring in her eyes. A long moment passed. She held his gaze, refusing to look away, though every instinct screamed at her to flee. Then, the corner of his scarred mouth lifted in something that was not quite a smile. It was a smirk, a flicker of wry, unexpected amusement. "You've got fire," he said, his voice a low drawl. "That'll do." He dropped his gaze back to the harness in his hands, dismissing her as if the conversation were over. Evelyn stood there, stunned into silence. It was not an apology. It was not an explanation. It was something else entirely, an answer that answered nothing and yet, somehow, changed everything. He had tested her, pushed her to see if she would break, and she had not. She turned and walked out of the barn, her legs shaky with the aftermath of adrenaline. The cool morning air felt clean and sharp in her lungs. She did not feel safe. She did not feel relieved, but she felt a sliver of something that had been absent for a long, long time. A sense of her own strength. He had seen the fire in her, the small, banked ember of defiance that had survived the shaming, the poverty, and the grief. As she walked back toward the house, the vast, rugged landscape of Montana seemed different. It was still a brutal and unforgiving place, a world where a woman's survival was a fragile and uncertain thing. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she was living in a world where men held all the power, and women were often forced to barter their safety with silence. But for the first time since arriving, she felt the weight of her own will. She had spoken when she was supposed to be silent, and in the cold, gray eyes of Cullen Wade, she had not seen contempt, but a flicker of something that looked dangerously like respect. It was not comfort, and it was not safety, but for now, it was enough. The confrontation in the barn did not bring warmth, but it did draw a line. Evelyn Monroe now understood that her survival on the Wade Ranch depended not on meekness, but on a quiet, unyielding resilience. And so she poured herself into the work, letting the rhythm of her labor become the rhythm of her days. She learned the specific groan of the well pump that meant the bucket was full. The precise heat of the cast-iron stove needed to bake bread that was crusty on the outside and soft within. The Montana landscape was a relentless taskmaster. The wind tore at the laundry she hung on the line, threatening to send it flying into the vast, dusty expanse. The water she hauled was shockingly cold, leaving her hands red and chapped. The wood she carried for the stove was heavy and splintered. But with each passing day, she felt a subtle transformation. A new strength bloomed in her arms and back. The calluses on her hands became badges of a hard-won competence. She was no longer just the preacher's disgraced widow. She was the woman who could feed 10 hungry men, who could mend a torn shirt with neat, practical stitches, and who could face the biting dawn without flinching. The land tested her, and in meeting its challenges, she began to reclaim a part of herself she thought had been buried with her husband. Cullen Wade watched her. He was a master of stillness, his presence a constant, unnerving pressure at the edge of her awareness. She would be kneading dough, her knuckles white with effort, and would look up to find him leaning against the doorframe, his gray eyes following the movement of her hands. He said nothing, his scarred face giving away no hint of his thoughts. The silence was a language of its own, and she did not know how to interpret it. Was it approval, suspicion, or simple, predatory observation? He was a puzzle she could not solve, a man made of locked doors and shadowed hallways. The ranch hands, too, watched her, though their gazes were more easily read, in their rough, infrequent conversations. She caught snippets of the rumors that swirled around her like dust devils. Some believed she was his mail-order bride, brought out on a trial basis. Others whispered a cruder theory, that she was his hired woman, her duties extending far beyond the kitchen. The thought made her skin crawl, but she held her head high, refusing to give their speculation the dignity of a reaction. She served them their meals with a polite, impenetrable distance, her silence a shield against their curiosity. Their whispers only reinforced her isolation, reminding her that her reputation, and therefore her safety, was a fragile thing, easily shattered. The fragility of her position was made terrifyingly clear one evening in late autumn. The air had turned sharp with the promise of snow, and a raw wind howled around the corners of the main house. The men had finished their supper and retreated to the warmth of the bunkhouse. Evelyn was washing the last of the pots, her mind blessedly empty, when the main door creaked open, letting in a blast of frigid air and the sound of a man's drunken singing. It was not one of the ranch hands. This man was a stranger, thick-set and grimy, his face flushed with cheap whiskey. He stumbled into the room, his eyes wild and unfocused. They landed on Evelyn, and a slow, leering smile spread across his face. "Well, now," he slurred, taking a clumsy step toward her. "Heard Wade finally got himself some company. They didn't tell me she was a pretty one." Evelyn's heart leaped into her throat. She stood frozen, the wet dish rag clutched in her hand. "You have the wrong place. You should leave." He chuckled, a wet, rattling sound. "Oh, I got the right place. Came all the way from the mining camp up north. A man gets lonely. Heard there was a cook here, willing to serve up more than just supper." He took another step, closing the distance between them. The stench of stale liquor and unwashed body rolled off him in waves. "I got coin. I'll pay. Now, how about you and me get to it? I'm sure it's my turn." Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. She backed away, her hand hitting the solid wood of the kitchen counter. "No, you are mistaken. Get out." "Don't play coy," he snarled, his brief good humor vanishing. He lunged, his hand grabbing her arm in a painful, iron grip. A scream tore from Evelyn's throat, raw and desperate. Before the sound had even faded, a shadow filled the doorway from the hall. It was Cullen. He had moved with a terrifying silence, and now he stood there, his body coiled with a lethal stillness. His eyes were not gray anymore. They were the color of storm clouds, dark and flashing with a violence that made the air crackle. "Take your hand off her," Cullen said. His voice was unnaturally calm, a low growl that was more menacing than any shout. The stranger turned, startled. He seemed to shrink under Cullen's gaze, but bolstered by the whiskey. He held his ground. "This ain't your business. Wade, I'm a paying customer." Cullen took one step into the room. "You have 3 seconds to let her go and walk out of my house." The man hesitated, then shoved Evelyn away from him. "Fine. Keep your woman to yourself." He turned to leave, muttering under his breath. He never made it to the door. Cullen moved in a blur of motion, his fist connecting with the stranger's jaw with a sickening crack of bone. The man crumpled to the floor, unconscious before he hit the boards. But Cullen was not finished. He hauled the man to his feet by the collar and hit him again. A brutal, methodical blow to the stomach that drove the air from his lungs in a wheezing gasp. He dragged the limp body outside, the man's boots scraping against the wooden porch. The sounds that followed were muffled and ugly, the thud of fists against flesh, a man's choked cry of pain, and then a final, heavy silence. Evelyn was pressed against the counter, her whole body trembling so violently she could barely stand. She was horrified. The savage, controlled brutality she had just witnessed chilled her to the core. This was the man she lived with, the man who held her fate in his hands. When Cullen came back inside, he shut the door, plunging the room back into its usual quiet. There was no mark on him, save for a slight scrape on his knuckles. He walked over to the water basin, washed his hands, and dried them on a towel, his movements deliberate and calm. He did not look at her until he was finished. When he finally turned, his eyes were gray again, the storm having passed, leaving behind a cold, desolate calm. He saw her, saw the terror in her face, the way she was shaking. He walked toward her, and she flinched, an involuntary recoiling that she could not control. He stopped a few feet away. "He won't be back," he said, his voice low. "No one will." He held her gaze, and for the first time she saw something flicker in the depths of his eyes, something other than anger or cold command. It was a raw, protective fire. "You belong here," he said, the words as solid and unyielding as the mountains outside. "I won't let them take that from you." He was claiming her, not as a lover, but as a part of his ranch, a part of his world that he would defend with a violence that took her breath away. And in that moment, beneath the horror and the fear, a strange and unwelcome feeling bloomed in her chest. Gratitude. No one had ever fought for her. Her husband had hidden from shame. Her congregation had cast her out. This hard, violent man had just declared her place in the world and sealed it with his fists. It was terrifying and confusing, but as she stood there, trembling in the aftermath, a single, fragile sliver of trust for Cullen Wade began to take root in the barren soil of her heart. In the days that followed, the incident was never mentioned. The ranch hands must have seen the stranger's battered form left on the trail, but they asked no questions. A new kind of silence settled between them and Evelyn, one tinged with a cautious respect. She was no longer just the cook. She was the woman the boss had protected. The change in her own perception of Cullen was profound. She began to watch him not with fear, but with a desperate curiosity. Who was this man who could be so brutal and yet so protective? Spurred by the tentative new trust between them, she began to ask questions, small and careful ones, testing the boundaries he had set on her first day. "Did you build this ranch yourself?" she asked one evening as she served him his coffee. He looked up, surprised by the direct question. He considered it for a moment before answering. "My brother and me. We built the main house first." It was the first time he had ever mentioned family. "Your brother," she repeated softly. "Does he live nearby?" A shadow passed over his face, so swift she almost missed it. "He's dead." The finality in his voice forbade any further inquiry. But the door, once cracked, was not entirely shut. Another time, as she mended one of his shirts by the fire, she commented on the fine quality of the fabric. "This is a good shirt, not like the ones the men get from the catalog." He was cleaning a rifle, his movements precise and economical. "It was a gift," he said without looking up. "From a friend?" she ventured. He stopped his work, his hands stilling on the rifle. "From a woman who promised me forever and gave me a year of lies." The bitterness in his voice was a raw, open wound. He said nothing more, but the fragment hung in the air, a piece of a story steeped in betrayal. The most she ever learned came one afternoon when he returned from a long ride, a darkness clinging to him like a shroud. He barely touched his food at supper. Later, she found him staring into the fire, a bottle of whiskey on the small table beside him. He looked up as she entered the room, and his eyes were full of ghosts. "My brother died protecting a lie," he said, his voice thick and low. "Her lie. I came back and found him in the ground and her in another man's arms." He took a long swallow of whiskey. "A man pays for mistakes like that. Some pay with money. I've paid in blood, mine and others, ever since." He would say no more, but the broken pieces of his past began to form a blurry, tragic picture in her mind. A beloved brother, a treacherous woman, and a debt of violence that Cullen was still paying. She began to see the scars on his soul, deeper and more painful than the one on his face. This new understanding was complicated by the small, almost imperceptible ways he began to care for her. His harsh treatment of others, the sharp word to a lazy hand, the cold dismissal of a cattle buyer who tried to haggle. It was all softened by the quiet gestures he directed only at her. One morning, she found the axe by the chopping block sharpened to a razor's edge, making her task of splitting kindling almost effortless. Another day, she discovered her favorite kitchen knife, which had grown dull, honed so finely it could slice through a potato as if it were butter. She came out of her small room one morning to find a stack of perfectly split, dry kindling waiting by her door, a silent offering against the morning chill, and he never admitted to any of it. Her boots, worn thin by endless trips to the well, finally split along the side. She had set them by the hearth to dry, worrying about how she would afford a new pair, or how she would manage the muddy yard without them. The next morning, they were gone. She searched for them in a quiet panic, only to find them later that day back in their spot, a neat, strong row of new stitches holding the leather together, the soles reinforced with a patch of hide. It was his handiwork. The stitching was as practical and unadorned as the man himself. He took to sitting on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun bleed across the western sky, if she was outside, mending clothes in the last of the light. He would sit on the top step, silent and watchful. He never spoke, but his presence was a solid, grounding thing. He was not a man of easy comforts or gentle words, but in his own gruff, silent way, he was making a space for her, acknowledging her existence in a way that went beyond her duties as a cook. Evelyn found herself caught in a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. She was drawn to his solitude, which she now understood was born of deep hurt. She was drawn to his strength, a force he had used to protect her, but she was also terrified of that same strength, of the violence he kept leashed just beneath the surface, and she was terrified of what he might one day ask for in return. Did these kindnesses come with a price? Was she slowly, unknowingly, creating a debt that she would one day be called upon to pay? The thought was a constant, low thrum of anxiety beneath the surface of her days. The first snows came, blanketing the ranch in a pristine, silent layer of white. The cold was a physical entity, a predator that stalked the edges of the firelight. One night, the temperature plummeted, and the wind shrieked like a banshee. Evelyn lay in her bed, shivering beneath two thin blankets, unable to find warmth. She heard a soft knock at her door. Her heart leaped, a frantic, frightened bird in her chest. "Who is it?" she called, her voice trembling. "It's Wade," came the low reply. She hesitated, then slowly slid the chair away from the door and opened it a crack. He stood there, holding a thick, heavy wool blanket, the kind reserved for long winter rides. "You'll freeze in here," he said, his voice a low rumble. He held the blanket out to her. She took it, her fingers brushing against his. His hand was rough and warm, and a jolt went through her at the brief contact. She flinched, pulling her hand back as if burned. It was an involuntary reaction, a ghost of her husband's unwelcome touch, of the stranger's brutal grip. The reaction did not go unnoticed. A flicker of something, was it hurt, frustration, crossed his face before his expression became guarded once more. He stood there in the doorway, the cold air swirling around him, and a heavy silence fell between them. He did not leave. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than she had ever heard it, a raw, gritty whisper that seemed torn from somewhere deep inside him. "I didn't hire you to warm my bed," he said, his eyes locked on hers. "But I won't lie, I think about it." The admission struck her with the force of a physical blow. It was everything she had feared and nothing like she had imagined. It was not a demand or a threat, but a confession, a statement of a struggle she had not known he was fighting. The air crackled with the sudden, terrible honesty between them. Her mind reeled, trying to reconcile this man with the man who had uttered those cold, cryptic words after supper weeks ago. She was trembling now, from the cold and the shock and the terrifying intimacy of his words. "Then why?" she whispered, the words barely audible. "Why did you say that night?" She could not finish the sentence. She did not need to. He knew what she was asking. A muscle worked in his jaw. For a moment, she thought he would answer, that he would finally unlock that door and explain the cruel remark that had haunted her for weeks. But he only held her gaze for another long, charged moment before his expression shuttered completely. Without another word, he turned and walked away down the dark hallway, his boots echoing on the wooden floor, leaving her alone in the doorway, clutching the warm, heavy blanket to her chest, more lost and confused than ever before. The quiet that followed Cullen's late-night confession was a fragile thing, a thin sheet of ice over a deep, cold river of unspoken feelings. The heavy blanket he had given her was a tangible reminder of the boundary he had drawn and then confessed to wanting to cross. Evelyn lived in the space between those two truths, a landscape of tension and uncertainty. She worked, she cooked, she kept the silence, but something had irrevocably shifted. The air was charged, and she felt as if she were holding her breath, waiting for a storm that was gathering just over the horizon. It broke on a moonless night in the dead of winter. The world was frozen, the snow on the ground squeaking underfoot with a dry, mournful sound. Evelyn had just finished scrubbing the last of the supper pots when the ranch dog, a scruffy mutt named Blue, erupted in a frantic, savage barking. It was not his usual bark for a passing coyote. This was a sound of alarm, a tearing, desperate noise that sent a spike of pure adrenaline through her veins. Almost immediately, a man's shout cut through the night, sharp and angry, followed by the terrifying, unmistakable crack of a rifle shot. The sound shattered the frozen stillness, echoing off the surrounding hills. Another shot answered it from the direction of the corrals. Evelyn dropped the pot she was holding. It hit the floor with a deafening clang. The kitchen door flew open, and Jed, his face pale in the lantern light, stood there with a shotgun in his hands. "Ma'am, get down!" he yelled, his voice strained. "Rustlers!" The word was a death knell in the unforgiving territory. Rustlers were not just thieves. They were killers. Desperate men who would not hesitate to leave a ranch in ashes and its occupants in their graves. Another gunshot, closer this time, splintered the wood of the doorframe. Jed shoved her toward the back of the house. "Go! The barn! Hide yourself in the hayloft and don't make a sound, no matter what you hear." Fear, cold and sharp, gave her feet wings. She ran, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The night air was a shock of icy cold, filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the shouts of angry men. She saw figures moving in the darkness, flashes of orange from the muzzles of rifles. She did not dare to look for Cullen. She just ran, her thin house shoes slipping on the packed snow, until she reached the looming shadow of the barn. She slipped inside, The familiar smell of hay and warm animals a strange comfort in the midst of the chaos. The horses were stirring in their stalls, their eyes wide with panic, their whinnies high and shrill. She scrambled up the rickety ladder to the hayloft, burrowing deep into the loose, sweet-smelling hay, pulling it over herself until she was completely concealed. From her hiding place, the battle for the Wade Ranch became a terrifying symphony of sounds. She heard Cullen's voice, a low, commanding roar that cut through the cacophony, directing his men. She heard the thunder of hooves, the splintering of wood as a fence rail gave way, the guttural cry of a man in pain. Each gunshot made her flinch, her body clenching in anticipation of the bullet finding its mark. She prayed, not the practiced, hollow prayers of her life with Thomas, but a desperate, primal plea to a God she was no longer sure she believed in. She prayed for the sounds of violence to stop. It felt like an eternity, but it could not have been more than 10 minutes. The furious barrage of gunfire slowly subsided, replaced by sporadic, single shots. And then, finally, an eerie, ringing silence broken only by the whimpering of a wounded man and the nervous stamping of the horses below. She lay frozen in the hay, every muscle screaming with tension, straining to hear, to understand who had won, who had lost, who was alive and who was dead. "It's over!" The voice came from the barn door below. It was Cullen's. It was weary, strained, but it was his. Relief washed over her so intensely her limbs felt weak. She waited, listening. She heard the low murmur of the men's voices, Jed's and Silas's, assessing the damage, after what felt like an age. She heard Cullen's footsteps on the ladder. He appeared at the top of the loft, a dark silhouette against the lantern light from the barn floor. "Evelyn?" His voice was rough. "I'm here," she whispered, her own voice barely working. She pushed the hay away and sat up, trembling. He came toward her, and in the dim light, she could see that his left sleeve was soaked through with something dark. His face was smudged with gunpowder, and a thin line of blood trickled from a cut on his cheekbone. But his eyes found hers, and they were clear and fierce. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, unable to speak. He reached down and took her hand, his grip surprisingly gentle, and helped her to her feet. "Come on, it's safe now." He led her down the ladder and back toward the house. 2 bodies lay in the snow-dusted yard, dark, still shapes that she forced herself not to look at. Another man was being tied up by Hank, his face a mask of pain and fury. The main house was a sanctuary of warmth and light. She stumbled inside, her body shaking with the aftermath of terror. Cullen slumped into a chair at the table, a wave of exhaustion washing over him. Only then did she get a clear look at his arm. A bullet had torn through the thick muscle of his forearm, a ragged, ugly wound that was still seeping blood. "Dear Lord," she breathed, the sight of it jolting her into action. "We need to clean that." She flew into motion, her fear replaced by a focused, urgent need. She brought the water basin, clean cloths, and the small bottle of carbolic acid she kept for kitchen cuts. She tore a strip from a clean linen sheet for a bandage. Her hands, to her own surprise, were steady as she knelt before him and began to gently wash the blood away. He sat perfectly still, his jaw tight, his eyes watching her every move. As she cleaned the wound, her fingers traced the landscape of his skin. The flesh was hard with muscle, but it was also a tapestry of old violence. A thin, white line disappeared under his sleeve, the remnant of a knife fight, perhaps. A puckered, round scar on his shoulder spoke of an older bullet. These were the marks of the life he had lived, the price he had paid in blood that he had spoken of. Seeing them, feeling them under her fingertips, made him suddenly, terrifyingly real. He was not just the hard, remote owner of this ranch. He was a man of flesh and blood, a man who could be hurt, a man who could die. He was vulnerable. He hissed as the carbolic acid touched the raw flesh, but he did not pull away. She worked in silence, her touch as gentle as she could make it. The intimacy of the moment was overwhelming. The smell of his skin, the warmth of his body, the quiet intensity of his gaze. It was all consuming. When she finally finished wrapping the bandage, her hands lingered for a moment on his arm. He looked down at her, his expression unguarded, the hard mask stripped away by pain and exhaustion. In the warm lantern light, she could see the weariness in his eyes, the deep lines of a pain that had nothing to do with the fresh wound in his arm. "I've never," he began, his voice a low, rough rasp. He stopped, swallowed, as if the words were stones in his throat. "I've never had a woman I respected touch me." He looked at his own hands, calloused and scraped. "The ones a man like me pays for. That's different. That's just a transaction. But this," he looked back at her, his eyes filled with a raw, painful honesty. "I don't know how to be close to someone without hurting them. It's all I've ever known. Taking, fighting, breaking. I don't know how to be gentle." His confession was a key turning a lock deep inside her. His brokenness mirrored her own. She thought of Thomas, of his hands on her in the dark, seeking his own release, never her comfort. His touch had not been violent in the way Cullen's world was, but it had been a different kind of hurt. The hurt of being used, of being an object for another's needs, of a closeness that only amplified her loneliness. "My husband," she heard herself say, the words coming out in a quiet rush. "He told me it was my fault he was unhappy, that my coldness drove him to his sins." She looked down at her own hands, twisting the damp cloth. "He said I was a poor wife, that I failed in my duty to him, and when he died, the whole church looked at me as if I were the one who had committed the crime. They shamed me for his weakness. They shamed me for surviving." She looked up, and her eyes met Cullen's. In their gray depths, she did not see pity. She saw understanding. They were two solitary souls, shipwrecked by betrayal and shame, now stranded on the same desolate shore. He had been betrayed by a woman he loved. She had been betrayed by the man who was supposed to love her. Both had been left to bear the shame of another's failings. In that moment of shared pain, the last of her fear of him dissolved, replaced by a profound and aching connection. The tension between them did not vanish, but it transformed. It was no longer a taut wire of fear and desire, but the resonant hum of two matching strings. In the weeks that followed, the unspoken bond between them deepened. The ranch settled back into its winter quiet, but the atmosphere had changed. The ranch hands, who had witnessed the fight and Cullen's fierce defense of his property, and by extension, of her, treated her with a new, quiet deference. But their respect was tinged with suspicion. They saw the way Cullen's eyes followed her, the way he lingered over his coffee just to be in the same room with her a little longer. They saw the easy, silent communication that passed between them. The rumors shifted from crude speculation to a quiet certainty. Their relationship, in the eyes of the men, was no longer professional. Evelyn felt it too. The ranch, which had once been her prison, then her sanctuary, now felt like something else entirely, a potential home. She found herself taking a new pride in her work, not just as a cook, but as a part of the lifeblood of the place. She mended the curtains in the main room, her stitches small and neat. She planted a small herb garden in a window box, hoping for spring. She was building a life, not just surviving one. The dream of a real home, a place of safety and belonging, began to grow in her heart, a fragile, dangerous seed. One evening, as a fresh blanket of snow fell outside, turning the world into a soft, silent expanse of white, Cullen approached her. The men had gone. They were alone by the fire, the only sounds the crackle of the logs and the sigh of the wind. "We need to talk," he said, his tone serious. He stood before the fire, his back to the flames, his scarred face a mask of shadows. "The men are talking. It's not right. You being here like this, alone. It's not safe for you. A woman's reputation. He trailed off, uncharacteristically hesitant. Evelyn's heart began to beat a little faster. She knew what was coming. I'm willing to offer you marriage, he said, the words blunt and practical, stripped of any sentiment. If you want protection, my name would keep you safe. No one would dare bother you again. It would be a business arrangement. You would have a home, a name. Nothing would have to change between us, unless you wanted it to. He was offering her everything she had ever thought she wanted. Safety, security, a place in the world. He was offering her a shield against the whispers and the judgment. But as she looked at him, at his hard, beautiful, broken face, she saw the truth in his eyes. He did not believe in love. He believed in transactions, in debts, in payments made in blood and loyalty. He was offering her a contract, not his heart. He was offering her protection. But what she was starting to realize she wanted, what she ached for with a longing that terrified her, was to be cherished. The preacher's wife in her, the woman who had married for duty and position, screamed at her to accept. It was a sensible, logical solution. But the new woman, the one who had found her own fire in the heart of this cold, lonely land, could not. No, she said, her voice soft but firm. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. No. Thank you, Cullen, she said, using his first name for the first time. It felt both strange and natural on her tongue. It is a more generous offer than I deserve, but I cannot accept it. Why? He asked, a flicker of something, confusion, maybe even hurt in his eyes. I thought you wanted to be safe. I do, she said, and she had to fight to keep her voice from breaking. But I will not marry for protection. I will not trade one kind of silence for another. I did that once. I married a man for a home and a name, and I was the loneliest I have ever been. She looked at him, her heart in her eyes. If I ever marry again, it will be because a man chooses me, not because he feels he has to protect me, or because it is a convenient arrangement. It will be for love, or it will not be at all. He stared at her for a long moment, the silence stretching between them. He looked like a man who had been offered a gift in a language he did not understand. He gave a single, curt nod, the mask of the hard rancher sliding back into place. As you wish, he said, his voice flat. He turned and left the room, leaving her alone with the fire and the howling wind. That night, Evelyn cried. She curled up in her small bed, clutching the heavy wool blanket he had given her, and wept. She cried for the loneliness that was her constant companion, a cold, empty ache in her chest. She cried for the man who knew how to fight and bleed and kill for her, but did not know how to love her. And she cried for her own stubborn, foolish heart, which had chosen the integrity of being alone over the safety of a loveless marriage. She had found her own strength, but she had not realized how heavy it would be to carry. The chasm that Evelyn's refusal had opened between them did not close. In its place grew a careful, painful courtesy. They spoke of the weather, of the dwindling supply of flour, of a sick calf in the north pasture. They moved around each other with a heightened awareness, two celestial bodies held in a tense orbit by a gravity they refused to name. Cullen's marriage proposal, as practical and unromantic as it was, had been an offering of a kind. Her rejection, born of a desperate need for a love he could not give, was a wall she had built to protect her own heart. Now they both lived behind their respective walls, occasionally peering over the top to gauge the other's loneliness. The harsh winter began its slow, muddy retreat, giving way to a reluctant spring. The snow melted in patches, revealing the sodden brown earth beneath. The world felt raw and exposed, and Evelyn's spirit felt much the same. She watched Cullen from a distance, seeing the profound isolation that clung to him like a shroud. He was a man utterly alone, not just in geography, but in spirit. He had offered her the only thing he knew how to give, His name, his protection, and she had thrown it back at him. The knowledge was a constant, dull ache in her chest. The arrival of the circuit rider in late April was a rare event, a brief connection to the world beyond the jagged peaks that ringed the valley. He brought mail, month-old newspapers, and gossip from the towns along his route. He usually brought a smile to the faces of the ranch hands. But the letter he handed to Evelyn Monroe turned the fragile spring day to ice. The envelope was thick, the handwriting an unfamiliar, spidery scrawl. It was addressed not to the ranch, but to the sheriff of Bozeman, and had been forwarded from there. Her name was on the front, stark and accusatory. Her fingers trembled as she broke the wax seal. The letter was from her late husband's cousin, a man named Silas Blackwood, a deacon in the church, and a man whose piety was matched only by his cruelty. She read the words, and the ground seemed to fall away beneath her feet. They were lies, twisted and venomous, crafted to destroy what little she had left. Blackwood wrote of her unnatural appetites and her wayward spirit, claiming she had driven the good Reverend Thomas to his early grave with her demands and her coldness. He painted her as a harlot who had fled Ohio just ahead of the law, a fallen woman who had likely seduced some poor, unsuspecting soul in the uncivilized West. The letter was an appeal to the authorities in Montana, a righteous demand that they find this stain on her husband's memory and have her retrieved and returned to her family, where she could be properly disciplined and guided back to a life of repentance. The paper shook in her hand. It was the same judgment, the same poison she had fled, but now it had followed her across a continent. They were not content to have cast her out. They wanted to drag her back, to cage her again in their suffocating righteousness. She did not realize she had made a sound until she looked up and saw Cullen standing in the doorway of the house. He must have seen her face, the blood draining from it, the sheer terror in her eyes. He crossed the yard in 3 long strides and took the letter from her unresisting fingers. His eyes, quick and sharp, scanned the page. As he read, his face became a mask of stone. The muscle in his jaw clenched and unclenched. When he was finished, he crumpled the letter in his fist, his knuckles white. "You'll leave tomorrow," he said, his voice flat and hard as granite. "At first light, I'll give you enough money to get to Oregon, California, if you prefer. Blackwood won't find you there." It was the voice of a man accustomed to solving problems with action, with distance, with finality. He was offering her an escape, the same escape she had chosen once before. But as she stood there, the Montana wind whipping strands of hair across her face, something inside her shifted. She looked at the mountains, at the vast, unforgiving land that had tested her and strengthened her. She thought of the silence, the loneliness, and the one man who had defended her with his fists and offered her his name. She had run from shame once. She would not do it again. "No," she said, her voice quiet but clear. He looked at her, his stormy eyes filled with a grim impatience. "This isn't a request, Evelyn. These people will ruin you. A letter like this, it's a brand. They'll hunt you down." "Let them," she said, and she felt a surge of strength, a fire she had forgotten she possessed. "I spent my whole life running. I ran from my father's expectations. I ran from my husband's misery, and I ran from the judgment of our church. I am tired of running." She met his gaze, and for the first time, she did not feel like his employee, or his ward, or a problem to be solved. She felt like his equal. "This is my home now. I will not be chased out of it." A flicker of something, surprise, grudging respect, passed through his eyes. He stared at her for a long moment, then gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. "Then we'll fight them here." But the letter was a stone cast into the quiet pond of the ranch, and the ripples spread quickly. One of the hands, a man named Blevins, with a sour turn to his mouth, must have seen the envelope from the sheriff's office. Whispers began to circulate in the bunkhouse, louder and more confident than before. The story twisted in the retelling, the lie from Ohio becoming a local truth. The cook was a woman of ill repute, a fugitive, The atmosphere on the ranch turned toxic. The men's quiet respect for Evelyn curdled into a sullen resentment. Their eyes now held a new, calculating light. If she was a fallen woman, then perhaps the boss was not the only one entitled to her company. A saddle would be left uncinched. A bucket of water would be accidentally spilled in her path. They were small aggressions. A campaign of petty cruelties designed to remind her of her place. Worse, they began to turn against Cullen. His judgment, once unquestioned, was now a subject of debate. He was being made a fool of by a woman, they whispered. He was risking the ranch's reputation, risking their very safety, for a cook who was nothing but trouble. The loyalty he had commanded through strength and fairness began to fray. The breaking point came one afternoon in the barn. Evelyn was fetching eggs when she overheard Blevins talking to Silas and another hand. "He's gone soft," Blevins said, his voice dripping with contempt. "Used to be this ranch was about work. Now it's about protecting his whore. I heard in Bozeman they're saying she's wanted. He's harboring a criminal." Before Evelyn could even react, Cullen's voice cut through the hay-dusted air, cold and sharp as a shard of ice. "Get your gear. Blevins, you're done here." Blevins spun around, his face a mixture of shock and defiance. Cullen stood in the wide barn doorway, a thundercloud of a man. "You can't fire me. Wade, the men won't stand for it. We all think the same. She's got you soft." Cullen did not raise his voice. He did not move a muscle. "I said, you're done. You have 5 minutes to be off my land. After that, I'll consider you a trespasser." The threat was absolute. Blevins looked at the other men for support, but they dropped their gazes, shuffling their feet in the dirt. His mutiny had failed, with a final, hateful glare at Cullen, and then at Evelyn. He spat on the ground and stalked off toward the bunkhouse. Cullen watched him go, his face impassive, but Evelyn saw it. She saw the cost of his decision in the sudden, profound stillness that settled over him. He had drawn a line, not just for Blevins, but for all of them. He had chosen her over the loyalty of his crew, over the stability of his ranch. In that moment, she saw his isolation not as a fortress he had built, but as a prison he now occupied alone. He had never seemed more powerful or more vulnerable. The loneliness that had been their separate burdens now became a shared space, a desolate territory they inhabited together. The remaining men did their work, but a chasm of silence and resentment separated them from Cullen and Evelyn. The long supper table felt cavernous. The silence between the three of them, Cullen, Evelyn, and the ever-loyal Jed, heavier than any words. Their shared solitude bonded them in a way that conversation never could. They were two outcasts, besieged from without by the judgment of the world, and from within by the mutiny of his own men. It was in this crucible of isolation that Evelyn finally understood the depth of her feelings for him. It was not gratitude, not fascination. It was a love as wild and unforgiving as the land itself, a love that had taken root in the hardest of soils. That night, a storm rolled in from the north, a furious assault of wind and rain that hammered against the roof and rattled the window panes. The world outside was a churning chaos of darkness and water. Inside, the fire in the hearth was the only point of warmth and light in an encroaching universe of cold. Cullen sat staring into the flames, a glass of whiskey untouched in his hand. He had not spoken a word since supper. The weight of his solitude was a palpable thing in the room. Evelyn watched him, her heart aching with a pain that was his and her own. He was fighting a war for her, and his only ally was a woman who had refused his help. In a moment of terrible clarity, she knew what she had to do. The risk of it made her tremble, but the certainty of it propelled her forward. She rose from her chair and crossed the room, her footsteps silent on the wooden floor. She stopped beside his chair, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He did not look up, but she knew he was aware of her every breath. She knelt down beside him, on the rough hearthstones. She had no words of comfort, no easy reassurances. She had only a desperate, painful offering, a way to cross the last chasm between them. "You can touch me tonight," she whispered, her voice barely a tremor in the storm-tossed quiet. She reached for the cruelest words she knew, the ones that had been the source of her deepest fear, and turned them into a key. "If that's really what you paid for." He flinched as if she had struck him. His head snapped up, and he stared at her, his face a mask of shock and a deep, agonizing pain. He looked stricken. "Evelyn, no!" "It's all right," she whispered, though it was not. "No," he repeated, his voice raw. He reached out and took her hand, his grip surprisingly gentle, his eyes stormy and filled with a feeling she had never seen there before, locked onto hers. "That's not what I want." His voice dropped, thick with an emotion that shattered her. "I want you to want me, without shame, without debt." His words undid her. He was not the man she had feared. He was the man she had hoped he could be. He had rejected the transaction. He was demanding her heart, whole and freely given. And in that moment, she gave it to him. She leaned forward, her decision absolute, and closed the small distance between them. She kissed him. It was not a kiss of passion, but of quiet desperation. A soft, trembling press of her lips against his. It was a question and an answer all at once. For a moment, he was utterly still, as if he did not know how to respond to a tenderness he had never known. Then, with a low groan that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul, he kissed her back. His arms came around her, pulling her from the floor into his lap. It was not the rough embrace she might have once expected, but a careful, almost hesitant holding, as if she were something precious he was afraid of breaking. They fell into each other then, gently, slowly, in the flickering firelight, with the storm raging outside. It was a hesitant exploration, a discovery of scarred landscapes, both inside and out. His hands, usually so sure and strong, trembled as they traced the line of her jaw, the curve of her neck. Her own hands came up to cup his face, her fingers brushing against the rough scar on his cheek. No longer a mark of fear, but a symbol of the battles he had fought. Every touch was tentative, every movement freighted with the weight of their past hurts and their shared loneliness. They were two broken people trying not to break each other further, trying to piece together a new kind of whole. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the warm cocoon of a blanket before the dying fire, Evelyn wept. The tears came silently, uncontrollably, streaming down her face and onto his chest. They were not tears of regret or shame, but of a sheer, shattering intensity of feeling. For the first time in her life, she felt utterly seen, completely desired for who she was, not for the role she played. She felt safe, not from the world, but within herself. The shame that had been her constant companion since her husband's death was finally, blessedly, gone, burned away in the gentle fire of his touch. He held her, stroking her hair, his body a solid, warm anchor in the dark. He did not speak until her tears had subsided into quiet, shuddering breaths. When he finally did, his voice was a low, rough murmur against her hair, filled with a wonder that mirrored her own. "You didn't just cook for me," he said, his words a revelation. "You fed something I forgot I had." The night of the storm did not wash away their problems, but it did clear the air between them. In its wake, a new world was born, one in which silence was no longer a void, but a shared space of comfort. The morning after, Evelyn awoke in Cullen's arms before the cold hearth, the heavy wool blanket a shared cocoon against the dawn chill. He was already awake, watching her, his gray eyes clear and calm, stripped of their usual storms. There was no awkwardness, no regret. There was only a quiet, profound sense of rightness. Their relationship deepened in the small, unspoken moments of the days that followed. It was in the way he would now reach out and take her hand as they sat on the porch in the evening. his calloused thumb stroking the back of her palm. It was in the rare, small smile that would touch his scarred lips when she told a story about her childhood. It was in the way she no longer felt the need to fill the silence, but could simply exist beside him, their solitudes merging into a shared peace. He began to talk to her of the ranch, not just of the work, but of his vision for it, the way he saw the lay of the land, the flow of the seasons. He was sharing his world with her, and she, in turn, began to feel her heart unfurling like a spring blossom after a long, hard winter. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady love that felt as solid and real as the mountains that framed their world. But the world outside their valley had not forgotten them. The poison that Silas Blackwood had sent in his letter was a slow-acting one, working its way through the territory's veins. One bright afternoon, as Evelyn was hanging laundry on the line, the scent of clean linen and fresh pine filling the air, she saw two riders approaching. One was the sheriff from Bozeman, a weary-looking man named Cutler. The other was a stranger, a man in a black wool suit that looked out of place and suffocating in the wide-open spaces of Montana. He was thin, with a pinched face and cold, assessing eyes. As they drew closer, she recognized the self-righteous cruelty in his expression. It was the face of her husband's family. It was Silas Blackwood. Cullen came out onto the porch, his body instantly alert, his hand resting almost casually on the Colt revolver at his hip. He stood between Evelyn and the approaching men, a human shield. "Wade," Sheriff Cutler said, his voice tired. He nodded at Blackwood. "This is Silas Blackwood. He's come all the way from Ohio. He has a warrant for Mrs. Monroe." Blackwood dismounted, holding a piece of paper in his hand as if it were a holy text. "Evelyn Monroe," he said, his voice thin and reedy, yet carrying a note of absolute authority. "By the authority of the state of Ohio and the township of New Hope, I have here a warrant for your arrest on charges of moral turpitude, public indecency, and absconding from the care of your family." The charges were absurd, a vile concoction of lies and legal jargon designed to sound official and damning. "That's the biggest load of horse manure I've ever heard," Cullen said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "This is my land. You're not taking her—" "It's a legal document. Wade," the sheriff said, his hand moving toward his own pistol. "I have to honor it. You know that. We'll take her back to Bozeman, and the judge can sort it out." Blackwood's lips twisted into a smug smile. "The woman is a stain on her good husband's name. She belongs with us. We will see to her repentance." The way he said the word made Evelyn's blood run cold. She knew what that meant. A life of shame and servitude. A prisoner in the house of the very people who had destroyed her. Cullen took a slow step forward. "You listen to me, you black-suited vulture," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was more terrifying than any shout. "You are not taking her. If you or any other man tries to lay a hand on her, I will personally see to it that the only thing that goes back to Ohio is a box full of your bones. That is not a threat. It is a promise." The sheriff's hand closed around the butt of his gun. "Wade, don't be a fool. Threatening a man in front of a lawman is a serious offense." The standoff was broken by the arrival of another rider, a circuit judge, a man named Miller, whose route happened to coincide with the sheriff's visit. He was an older man with a stern, lined face and eyes that had seen every kind of human folly. He took in the scene. Cullen, a coiled spring of violence. Blackwood, radiating smug piety. Evelyn, pale but defiant. And the sheriff, caught in the middle. Judge Miller read the warrant, his expression unreadable. He listened to the sheriff's account of Cullen's threat. Then, he turned his cool gaze on Evelyn. "This is a complicated matter. It seems to me we have two issues here, a warrant from another state and a threat of violence made in my jurisdiction." He looked from Evelyn to Cullen. "I will hold a hearing in Bozeman tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. In the meantime, Mrs. Monroe will remain here, and Mr. Wade, You will give me your word that there will be no more threats." Cullen gave a curt, angry nod. Blackwood looked displeased, but he could not argue with a judge. He and the sheriff rode away, leaving a toxic silence in their wake. That evening, the ranch was a fortress of tension. Cullen paced the main room like a caged wolf. "I can get you out tonight," he said, his voice raw with frustration. "We can ride north, be in Canada in 3 days. They'll never find us." "And you would lose all of this?" she asked, gesturing around at the room, at the home he had built with his own 2 hands. "Because of me?" "This is just land," he said fiercely. "Wood and nails. It's not worth you." His words were a brand on her heart, but she shook her head. "No, Cullen, I told you, I'm not running anymore." The next morning, they rode into Bozeman. The town was already buzzing with the news. A hearing in the saloon, which doubled as a courtroom, was a rare and exciting event. The room was crowded with ranchers, merchants, and townspeople, all eager for a spectacle. Blackwood was there, sitting at a front table, looking for all the world like a man at a church social. Judge Miller called Evelyn into a small back room before the hearing began. Cullen came with her, his presence a solid wall at her back. The judge looked at her over the top of his spectacles, his expression not unkind, but deeply weary. "Mrs. Monroe," he said, "I have read this letter your husband's cousin sent ahead of him. I have also heard the whispers about you and Mr. Wade. This territory is a hard place, but it has its own code of conduct. A woman's reputation is everything." He leaned forward, his voice low. "I am going to offer you a way out of this. A clean slate. This warrant from Ohio is flimsy. I can make it disappear. And Mr. Wade's threat, that is a more serious matter. A man cannot be allowed to threaten others in the street, no matter the provocation." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But if the woman he was protecting was in fact his victim, if she were to testify that he has been holding her here against her will, that he is a harsh, abusive man, then his threat could be seen as the act of a possessor, not a protector. The court would look favorably on you. The charges against you would vanish. You would be free. We would even arrange for your transport back to your family." Evelyn stared at him, horrified. He was offering her a path to freedom that was paved with the ruin of the one man who had ever shown her true kindness. He was asking her to become the treacherous woman who had destroyed Cullen's brother, to confirm the world's worst assumptions about them both. Before she could speak, Cullen stepped forward. He looked not at the judge, but at her, his gray eyes dark with a terrible, selfless love. "He's right. Evelyn," he said, his voice rough. "It's the only way. You can't let them do this to you. My reputation is already shot. What's one more lie? Don't let them ruin you to protect me." He reached out and touched her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "If protecting me ruins you, then don't do it." He was giving her permission. He was willing to be branded an abuser, a villain, to be thrown in jail or run out of the territory, just so that she could be safe. And in that moment, her resolve hardened into something unbreakable. She turned to Judge Miller. "I am ready to speak, Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and strong. "But I will be speaking the truth." She walked out into the crowded saloon, a sea of curious, judgmental faces turning toward her. Cullen stood near the back, his face a grim mask. She took her place before the judge's makeshift bench, took a deep breath, and began to speak. "My name is Evelyn Monroe," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the silent room. "And I am not a harlot, and I am not a criminal." She looked directly at Silas Blackwood, whose smug expression began to waver. "I am a widow. My husband was a preacher who used God's name to hide his sins. And when those sins came to light, his family and his church, the people sitting in judgment of me today, did not comfort me in my grief. They shunned me. They shamed me. They condemned me not for anything I had done, but for everything I had endured. A murmur went through the crowd. I came west because I had nothing and no one, she continued, her voice gaining strength. I answered an advertisement for a cook. I have worked hard for Mr. Wade. He has treated me with a respect I have never known from any other man, including my own husband. She looked toward Cullen. He is a hard man. Yes, he is a quiet man, but he is a good man. The only threat he has ever posed is to those who would try to harm me. She turned her gaze back to the crowd, her eyes sweeping over the faces of the women there. Some looked away, their faces tight with disapproval, but others, a few, met her gaze. She saw in their eyes a flicker of recognition, the silent acknowledgement of a shared burden. You want to know the truth? She said, her voice ringing with a passion that came from the very core of her soul. The truth is that I was used and discarded by my husband's family. The truth is that I was blamed for a man's weakness. The truth is that I found more dignity and more Christianity in the quiet decency of a lonely rancher than I ever found in a church full of hypocrites. She looked at Blackwood one last time. You did not come here to save my soul. You came here because you could not stand the thought of a woman surviving the shame you tried to bury her under. Well, I have survived, and I am not going back. She finished, her heart pounding, her words hanging in the thick, smoky air. The room was utterly silent. The men looked uncomfortable, scoffing quietly amongst themselves. The women were a study in contrasts. Some pulled their shawls tighter, turning away from her in judgment, while others, the ones with weary lines around their eyes, gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod of understanding. She had not won them all over. She had not expected to, but she had spoken her truth. She had taken back her own story. Judge Miller cleared his throat, his face unreadable. This court finds no grounds to honor the warrant from Ohio, he declared. And while your methods are unorthodox, Mr. Wade, given the testimony, the charges of threatening an individual are hereby dismissed. He banged his gavel. This hearing is over. It was over. Blackwood sat stunned, his face purple with rage. Cullen moved through the crowd toward her, his eyes blazing with a pride and a love that took her breath away. But as the townspeople began to file out, their whispers followed her, a cloud of speculation and judgment that would likely never fully dissipate. That night, back at the ranch, the victory felt fragile. Cullen stood by the window, looking out at the vast, dark land that was his kingdom and his prison. We could still go, he said quietly. This won't be the end of it. The whispers will follow you now. You'll never be free of it here. He was ready to give it all up, to become a fugitive, to protect her reputation. Evelyn went to him, standing behind him and wrapping her arms around his waist, pressing her cheek against his strong back. I don't want protection anymore, she said, her voice firm. I've been protected, and hidden, and managed my whole life. I want a life that's mine, even if it's hard, even if people whisper. She looked past him, out the window at the same dark land. I choose this. I choose you. Here, no more running. He turned in her arms, his hands coming up to cup her face. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and she saw in his eyes that he finally understood. She was not a fragile thing to be sheltered. She was his partner, as strong and resilient as he was. That night, they came together again, but it was different. It was not born of loneliness or desperation. It was not an escape from a storm or a frantic bid for comfort. It was a choice. It was the slow, deliberate, and powerful act of two people who had fought their way through fire and judgment, who had faced down the ghosts of their pasts and the malice of the present, and had finally, freely, chosen each other. It was not payment, not protection, not a bargain made in the dark. It was a beginning. The public hearing in Bozeman was not a victory that brought peace, but a battle that redefined the war. Evelyn and Cullen returned to the ranch not as fugitives, but as outlaws of a different sort. A man and a woman who had dared to write their own laws of love and loyalty in the face of society's harsh judgment. The whispers from town were a constant, low wind, but within the valley, a new foundation was being laid. Stone by painful stone, time, which had once been her enemy, now became her ally. The passing of seasons marked not just a survival, but a slow, deliberate rebuilding. With Blevins gone and the other men chastened by the public showdown, the atmosphere on the ranch shifted. Their resentment, born of suspicion, was slowly eroded by something else. A grudging admiration for the woman who had not broken. Evelyn was no longer just the cook. The change was subtle at first. She began to manage the household supplies, not just for the kitchen, but for the entire ranch. Her careful accounting stretching every dollar further than Jed's gruff estimates ever had. She learned the difference between good and poor feed, the signs of sickness in a horse, the complex logistics of a cattle drive. She did not ask for the responsibility. She simply took it, filling the voids she saw with a quiet competence that was impossible to ignore. She became the ranch's memory, keeping track of mended fences and lame horses. She was the one who negotiated with the traveling peddler for a better price on salt licks and wool blankets. The men, who had once seen her as a liability, began to see her as an asset. They started coming to her with their problems, a torn shirt, a festering cut, a letter from home they needed help reading. She treated each man with a simple, practical kindness, a dignity that had long been absent from their rough lives. She was not the boss's woman. She was the heart of the ranch, the quiet force that turned a collection of lonely men into something that felt almost like a family. The true turning point, the event that forged their respect into something as hard and lasting as steel, came with the dry heat of late summer. A lightning strike miles to the south had started a prairie fire. For days, it was a distant threat, a hazy, orange smudge on the horizon that turned the sunsets into a fiery, apocalyptic spectacle. Then the wind shifted. It came roaring from the south, a hot, merciless gale that drove the fire toward their valley at a terrifying speed. The world became a blur of frantic, organized chaos. Cullen was a master of such moments, his voice calm and commanding as he directed the men to drive the main herd north, toward the river, the only reliable firebreak for miles. Others were tasked with digging trenches and soaking the ground around the house and barns. The air grew thick and hot, tasting of ash. The sun was a dim, red eye in a sky the color of slate. Evelyn worked alongside them, her face smudged with soot, her lungs burning. She hauled buckets of water until her arms felt like lead, her dress soaked with sweat and grime. As the last of the main herd was being driven out, a cry went up from Silas. The young hand, a new calf, born just the week before, had been separated from its mother in the panic and had bolted back toward the southern pasture, directly into the path of the oncoming blaze. Its mother stood bawling at the edge of the herd, unwilling to leave.
"It's too late,"
Jed yelled over the roar of the wind.
"The fire's almost on us. The calf is lost."
Cullen's face was a grim mask of acceptance. A single calf was not worth a man's life. But Evelyn saw the mother cow's distress, heard the faint, terrified bleating of the calf on the wind, and she could not accept it. This ranch was no longer just a place she worked. It was a place she was building. Every life on it, no matter how small, was hers to protect. Before anyone could stop her, she ran to the corral, saddled the fastest mare, a nimble-footed buckskin named Daisy, and swung herself onto its back.
"Evelyn, no!"
Cullen's roar was lost in the wind. She did not hesitate. She urged the mare into a gallop, her hair flying loose behind her. She rode low over the horse's neck, the heat growing more intense with every stride. The smoke was a thick, choking blanket, and embers, carried on the wind, stung her skin like angry hornets. She found the calf huddled in a small, rocky outcrop, paralyzed with terror. The line of orange flames less than 100 yards away and closing fast. She dismounted, her heart hammering. She used her own body to shield the calf from the terrifying sight of the fire, murmuring to it in a low, soothing voice. She untied the rope from her saddle, looped it gently around the calf's neck, and began the slow, arduous task of leading it back, pulling it away from the terrifying noise and heat. The mare, blessedly calm, followed at her heels. It was a desperate race against a wall of consuming flame. The heat was a physical blow, the air searing her lungs. She could feel the fire at her back, a living, breathing monster. Just when she thought her strength would give out, that they would all be consumed, two figures on horseback burst through the thickest of the smoke. It was Cullen and Jed, their faces covered with wet bandanas. Cullen did not speak. He simply reached down, scooped the calf up into his powerful arms, and laid it across his saddle. "Get on!" he yelled to her. He helped her scramble up behind him, and together, the three of them rode hell for leather away from the inferno, reaching the relative safety of the riverbank just as the flames devoured the pasture where she had stood moments before. They saved the ranch. The fire burned itself out against the river, leaving a blackened, smoking scar across the southern end of their land. But the house, the barns, and the herd were safe. That evening, as the exhausted hands gathered for a silent, grateful meal, no one looked at Evelyn as the cook. They looked at her with a kind of awe. She had not been the protected woman cowering in the house. She had been one of them, a rider who had faced the fire and won. She had proven herself not with words, but with a courage that was as fierce and undeniable as the land itself. Later that week, as the last of the embers died and the air began to clear, Cullen found her on the porch, watching the first stars appear in the bruised twilight sky. The land smelled of charcoal and wet earth. He came and stood beside her, not speaking for a long time. The quiet between them was deep and comfortable. "I was wrong," he said finally, his voice low and rough. She turned to look at him. "About what?" "That day in Bozeman," he said. "When I told you we should run, I thought I was protecting you." He shook his head, a small, self-deprecating gesture. "But you don't need my protection. You have a strength that I've never seen in anyone, man or woman. You are the strongest person I know." Evelyn Monroe. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. It was a simple, unadorned ring, a thin band of braided silver. It was not fancy or expensive, but it was beautiful. "I'm not offering you my name for safety," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "And this isn't a business arrangement. I'm asking you to be my wife because this ranch is just a piece of land without you. My life is just a stretch of empty days without you." He held the ring out to her, his hand steady. "I'm asking because I love you, and there's no pressure. You are free. You can say no, and nothing will change. You will always have a home here." Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of a profound, overwhelming joy. He was not saving her. He was choosing her, as his equal, as his partner. He was loving the woman she had become, the woman who could stand on her own.
"Yes,"
she whispered.
"Yes, Cullen, I will marry you."
She said yes not because she needed a savior, but because she loved the man who had let her stand, the man who had seen the fire within her and was not afraid to stand beside it. Their peace was a hard-won, beautiful thing, but the outside world had one last ghost to send. A few months later, a new traveling preacher set up a tent for a revival meeting on the outskirts of Bozeman. He was a fire and brimstone sermonizer, a man who peddled fear and judgment for coin. And his sermon, as word of it drifted back to the ranch, centered on the wickedness of the frontier, using as his prime example the fallen woman of Bear Creek, the harlot who had bewitched a local rancher and flouted the laws of God and man. Evelyn knew she could ignore it. She was safe. She had Cullen. She had her home, but the words were a reopening of an old wound, and she knew that true freedom meant not just surviving the cut, but ensuring it could never be made again. This time, she would not be defended. She would speak for herself. She rode into town on the Sunday of his final sermon, with Cullen riding silently beside her. She did not go to the saloon, but to the revival tent itself. She walked in just as the preacher was reaching the fever pitch of his condemnation, his voice ringing with righteous fury as he described her supposed sins. She walked down the center aisle, the crowd parting before her, their faces a mixture of shock and eager anticipation. She stopped before the makeshift pulpit, a small woman in a simple dress, yet possessing a presence that commanded the entire tent into a sudden, breathless silence. The preacher faltered, his words dying in his throat. Evelyn looked not at him, but at the faces in the crowd, the same faces that had watched her in the saloon. "I hear you have been speaking of me," she said, her voice calm and clear, carrying to every corner of the tent. "I speak of a sinner," the preacher thundered, recovering himself. "A Jezebel who has led a good man astray." Evelyn's gaze did not waver. "You speak of a woman you do not know," she said. "You condemn a life you have not lived. You use God's name to pass judgment, but you know nothing of His grace." She took a step closer, and her voice rose, not in anger, but with the pure, unwavering force of her own truth. "Let me tell you who I am. I am a woman who was left with nothing but the shame of a man's failings. I am a woman who survived, and I am a woman who found a home in a place you would call godless." Her eyes flashed, and the fire he had accused her of possessing now blazed for all to see. "God didn't make me a whore because I survived," she declared, her voice ringing like a bell. "He made me a fire because I had to burn to live." She turned, without another word, and walked out of the tent, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. Cullen was waiting for her, his eyes shining with a love so fierce it made her heart ache. He took her hand, and together, they mounted their horses and rode away from the town, leaving the whispers and the judgment behind them for the last time. The story ends here, but their life was just beginning. It ends with Evelyn, now Evelyn Wade, standing on the porch of the ranch house, the silver band on her finger a quiet, constant comfort. She looked out over the harsh, beautiful land, a landscape that had once seemed so brutal and unforgiving, but now felt like an extension of her own soul. It was a land of scars and struggles, but also of breathtaking beauty and resilient life. Cullen came and stood beside her, his arm sliding around her waist, his presence a solid, unwavering anchor. They stood together, two scarred but strong souls, looking out at the world they had built, a world that was finally, truly theirs. Her final thought was not of the past, but of the simple, profound truth of her journey. She had come here seeking wages, a way to feed herself. She had been hired to feed a lonely man, but in the wilds of Montana, she had found the courage to feed her own soul instead. Thank you for joining us around the campfire for this tale. Please comment with where you are listening from to connect with fellow travelers. Subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.